Her words came out barely above a whisper. "Sitting brings me pain." The entire community turned their backs, except for one soul who chose to listen. Bell's Hollow stirred to consciousness slowly, draped in the amber haze of another New Mexico. Dawn. The morning air carried the aroma of fresh-baked bread mixed with desert heat, creating an atmosphere thick with unspoken tensions. Near the church courtyard's edge, Marianne struggled with an armload of cast-iron cookware, her petite frame. Overwhelmed by the burden. Though only 19, she carried herself with the cautious movements of someone far older deliberate, as afraid that any sudden motion might expose her secrets. Within the church kitchen, the minister's wife commanded the space with sharp orders, flour dusting her apron as she worked. The women preparing the Sunday meal chattered with swift judgment. But Marianne drifted among them like a specter, speaking to no one, touching only what was absolutely necessary. As she bent to arrange kindling by the stove, pain flashed across her features, the slightest intake of breath, nearly inaudible, but unmistakable. Sister Darlene. One of the elder churchwomen noticed as she walked past. "Child, why are you moving around like a wounded animal?" she asked. Rising carefully, Marianne's voice emerged, parched and fragile. "Sitting brings me pain." Just those few words spoken like a secret, the kitchen fell silent for one heartbeat. Then Sister Darlene's smile grew cold and dismissive. "Perhaps better posture would serve you well," she remarked before walking away. The other women resumed their gossip, unpressed for details. None wanted to understand. Marianne retreated to scrub the stone steps behind the chapel, where she could breathe without curious stares. Her wrists bore angry marks, and her dress hem was soaked through. She lowered herself onto the bottom step's edge for just a moment. When her body made contact with the stone, she jerked back sharply, biting her lip to silence any cry. A breeze kicked up dust behind her. She believed herself alone until the distinctive ring of metal on stone reached her ears.
On the opposite
side of the road, beneath the blacksmith's shelter, a figure leaned against a wooden post broad-shouldered, motionless, observing. His weathered face bore the marks of time and flame, a graying beard framing eyes so steady they seemed to see without blinking. The townspeople knew him as Caleb Rhea Wanderer, a recluse, a man who'd buried his voice the day death claimed his wife and child, and hadn't wasted words since. Marianne met his gaze briefly before standing, smoothing her skirt, and vanishing around the corner. That evening, during worship, she occupied a back pew alone. Every wooden bench had been polished smooth by countless bodies over the years, but the instant she settled down, a sharp breath escaped her lips, not loud, yet audible enough. Several heads turned. The preacher paused, then smiled broadly and raised his voice. Drowning her discomfort in his rhythmic sermon, Marianne stared down at her folded hands, which trembled slightly. Across her knuckles ran thin marks resembling old rope burns. She glanced toward the exit and glimpsed a wide-brimmed hat silhouetted in the twilight. Caleb stood by the hitching rail, arms folded, unmoving. He hadn't entered the service, but he hadn't departed either. Inside the chapel, the congregation sang harmonized hymns. Outside, one man remained motionless in the dust. Witnessing what everyone else refused to acknowledge, Reverend Silas Coates commanded the pulpit with authority, his palms pressed against his leather-bound scripture. He delivered sermons with passion burning in his chest and a smile honed by strict discipline. To the community, he embodied devotion, a beacon of light in a place that clung to tradition like sailors to a life raft. For 20 years, he'd baptized every infant in Bell's Hollow, laid fathers to rest, joined daughters in marriage, and never missed a Sunday service. He also possessed the girl who cleaned his floors since age 14. Marianne had occupied the rear room of the Coates residence after fever claimed her parents during that terrible summer. The Reverend had welcomed her out of Christian charity, as he frequently reminded her. But mercy was absent from the dark corner where she slept, containing only a bare cot and a rusted wash basin where she cleaned herself in silence. The Reverend's wife, Lucille, governed the household with prison-like severity. She praised Marianne's modesty to the churchwomen, calling her sweet and appreciative. Yet at home, Lucille corrected her posture with a ladle's edge and punished sluggishness by rubbing salt into scraped knuckles. After that evening's service, Marianne returned to the Coates' home alone. The Reverend remained for a church board meeting. She entered through the back door, hands still carrying the scent of candle wax and ash. In the dim kitchen, Lucille sat mending a hymnal cover without, looking up as she spoke. "You brought shame upon us," she said, crying out in church like an injured animal. Marianne remained silent. "You must learn stillness. You must understand that suffering is part of submission." Still, Marianne said nothing. Lucille set aside her needle. "Go to your room. Tomorrow you'll scrub the chapel steps before dawn. Perhaps kneeling will remind you of your purpose here." Marianne ascended the creaking stairs, each step echoing the strain in her back and legs. In the attic room, she curled against the wall, clutching her worn blanket with knees drawn close. Through a roof crack, a distant star flickered. She didn't pray. She didn't weep. She simply stayed awake. Beyond the town boundaries in the glow of dying coals, Caleb Reese sat on his porch, polishing a horseshoe with slow, methodical strokes. His hands bore the black stains of years working with ash and steel. But he paused periodically, gazing south toward the chapel, as if listening for something only he could hear. The wind descended from the mesa like an exhausted sigh in dawn's half-light. Calibri was already at his forge behind the cabin, coaxing flames from coal with practiced rhythm. His scarred and calloused hands moved without conscious thought. He hadn't spoken in days. Didn't need to. The fire understood his intentions. The ringing of hammer against iron shattered the stillness momentarily. As the metal bent to his will, Caleb's thoughts returned to the chapel girl. The way she moved as though her own flesh betrayed her. Anguish shimmered beneath her skin like bruises hidden under Sunday clothes. He'd witnessed that kind of suffering before in war, among women who appeared at the fort's back entrance, begging for bread in silence, and his wife one winter night, when blood and life drained from her faster than he could contain it. Most of all in his daughter. Her name was Rose, soft-spoken and inquisitive, with hair like corn, silk, and a habit of leaving wildflowers on his anvil. She died at 7, caught by fever that swept through half the county. Caleb had buried her himself beneath the cedar tree near the pasture, and when he placed the final stone, he buried his voice in the earth with her. Nearly 15 years had passed since he'd spoken more than a few words. Now something about Marianne had awakened that buried part of him. Back in town, Marianne knelt before the chapel steps, scrubbing with lye water and a coarse brush. Her hands were swollen and pink, fingers cracked and bleeding. Her threadbare dress had soaked through from knees to hem. Each time she shifted position, she winced slightly, but no one paused to notice. She worked in isolation as the town bustled around her. Men rolled barrels, women exchanged eggs for fabric, children chased dogs down the street. No one offered her water. No one questioned why a young woman was scraping stone steps on her knees before breakfast. When Reverend Coates passed with hands clasped behind his back, he smiled with apparent pride. "Obedience brings divine favor, child," he said. Marianne didn't respond. She didn't raise her head, just continued scrubbing. Across the road near the hitching posts, Caleb stood silently beside his cart, one hand on a feed sack's worn strap, the other resting at his hip. His horse snorted softly beside him, but he made no move to secure it. He was watching her. Their eyes met for just an instant. No. Hers appeared dull, drained, wary. His remained unreadable. She looked away first. Inside the store, Caleb purchased rope and a bag of nails. The shopkeeper asked, "Building a fence, Mr. Ree?" Caleb didn't answer. He dropped 2 silver coins on the counter and left. That evening, long after the streets had emptied, Marianne sat on her attic room floor, arms wrapped around her legs. Her body ached with constant burning pain. Her eyes stared blankly at the warped ceiling above, where a single nail hung half-driven into the beam. A spider moved silently across it. On his porch, Caleb stared into his cooking fire's flames. The rope from earlier lay coiled beside him untouched. In his lap, an old hunting knife sat partially sharpened. His thumb traced its edge slowly, not cutting, just remembering. He remembered what it felt like to arrive too late. He remembered silence and how it buries you alongside the dead. And now, for the first time in years, he felt something else stirring in old. Rusted instinct awakening, the need to protect, the fear that this town would turn away again. The following morning, just before sunrise, the town awakened beneath a sky the color of aged parchment. Daylight alone could cleanse whatever lingered from the night. But this morning's air carried a weight that even the sun couldn't lift. Marianne stood at the pump behind the chapel, filling a metal bucket with shaking hands. Her knuckles were now wrapped in linen, and one eye bore the faded remnant of a bruise beneath light powder. She wore the same blue dress as before dried, stiff and patched at the waist. Her body moved more slowly than usual, but her silence remained constant. Inside the chapel, Reverend Coates rehearsed his sermon, reading aloud with gentle intensity about submission and grace. Justice never entered his sermons. It rarely did. As Marianne passed the main street with her bucket, Caleb stepped into her path. He'd arrived early, too early to be coincidental, and stood near the water trough as though examining the woodwork. She saw him. She stiffened, nearly dropping the handle. "Are you well?" he asked quietly. His voice was rough, deep, seldom used. Marianne didn't look up. She kept walking, but Caleb turned to follow her with just 2 steps. He didn't reach for her or press harder, just said, "You don't need to remain silent." She froze. Then, without turning, she replied, barely above the wind's sound, "That's what they told the previous girl." And she continued walking. Caleb stood, motionless for a long while after that. Later that morning, he walked to the sheriff's office, boot heels echoing against the wooden planks. Sheriff Myron Hensley was leaning back in his chair with a toothpick in his mouth and a rifle across his lap. He looked up, unsurprised. "Well, I'll be Caleb Bree in town twice in 2 days. Must be the end times." Caleb said nothing at first. Then, "The girl at the chapel, she's injured." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Girl? You mean Marianne, the Reverend's? Ward, she's fine? Is that what she told you?" "No, she didn't have to." The sheriff chewed his toothpick. "Listen, I know you've been living alone out there for years, and I respect a man who keeps to himself. But you come in here with hearsay about a preacher and his wife, people who feed that girl and provide her shelter without proof." He leaned forward. "You're going to find yourself the talk of the town, and not in a good way." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Sheriff Hensley sighed. "Don't poke at things you don't understand. Sometimes keeping peace means leaving." Well enough alone, Caleb turned and left. By late afternoon, whispers had spread that Caleb Ree had taken an interest in the girl, that he was meddling, that perhaps the years of isolation had softened his mind, or worse. Inside the Coates home, Marianne stood at the window with her hands pressed to the frame. She'd seen Caleb speaking to the sheriff. She didn't know why that mattered, but somehow it did. That night, when the house grew quiet and the oil lamps were extinguished, Marianne did not sleep. She lay still in the darkness and whispered a single sentence into the void. "Please don't stop noticing." The scent of iron and oil still clung to Caleb Ree's clothes as he stood beside the corral, staring past the hills with a posture carved from stone he hadn't eaten since the previous day. Hunger rarely visited him, not the kind that came from food anyway. Inside his barn, hanging by the door, was a satchel he hadn't touched in years, one that once held his daughter's hair ribbons, and the wooden horse he'd carved for her 6th birthday. That satchel would travel with him again, but not today. He kept hearing her voice, Marianne's voice. Low, dry, honest. That's what they told the previous girl. It hadn't been said for pity. It was a confession. A quiet plea wrapped in warning. He walked to his anvil and lit the forge, not to work, but to think. Flames helped him think. Fire didn't lie. It either consumed or didn't. Across town, Marianne stood barefoot in the dusty yard behind the Coates home, hanging laundry in the full glare of midday. The lines trembled in the dry air, dresses and aprons swaying like ghostly limbs. Behind her, The back door creaked open. "Still got enough strength to lift linens?" came Lucille Coates' voice. "Then I suppose your back isn't broken." Marianne didn't reply. She just reached for another sheet. "You think because some blacksmith raised his eyebrows the world's going to change?" Lucille stepped forward now, voice lower. Let me tell you something, girl." And like Caleb Ree comes sniffing around when they want something broken to fix. "You think he sees you? He sees a burden." Marianne turned slightly. Her voice was quiet, but no longer trembled. "Better to be a burden than invisible." Lucille struck her hard across the mouth, no warning, no hesitation, just the sound of palm against skin and silence so thick it could shatter. Marianne didn't fall. She didn't flee. She simply stepped back one pace, wiped her lip with the back of her hand, and returned to the sheet. Lucille said nothing more. Caleb came into town that evening not on horseback, but on foot. He walked the long road slowly and deliberately, not speaking to anyone, not meeting faces. He passed the saloon, the post office, the barber shop. Every man on the boardwalk noticed. So did every woman behind curtains. He went straight to the chapel. The front doors were open, light spilling across the steps Marianne had scrubbed. Inside, Reverend Coates stood adjusting hymnals for the next day's sermon. His face brightened with a false smile when he saw Caleb. "Brother Ree," he said, "a rare honor. Have you come seeking prayer?" Caleb stepped forward, stopping just 1 foot. "From the pulpit? No." The smile faded. "Then what brings you to God's house at this hour?" Caleb looked around slowly. "She shouldn't be under your roof." The Reverend stiffened. "I beg your pardon? You don't feed her? You don't shelter her? You keep her as punishment. It's like a dog that cowers when you raise your hand. Now see here, I see enough." The silence that followed was thick and blistering. Coates adjusted his collar. "You're treading dangerous ground, son." Caleb stepped back toward the exit. "I buried my daughter under a cedar tree on Ridgeback Hill. She never once cowered when I raised my voice. That's how I know what love isn't." And with that, he left the chapel. He didn't see the figure hiding just inside the vestibule Marianne. Her body pressed flat against the inner wall, fists clenched at her sides, her breathing unsteady. For the first time in 5 years, someone had spoken aloud what she had only dared to think. It echoed inside her like thunder promising rain. It was nearly midnight when Marianne packed the box. She did it slowly, not from hesitation, but because every bone in her body ached like they remembered too much. In the dim attic light, she wrapped her shawl around a small tin of ointment, the kind she used when bruises ran too deep for fabric. To hide, she added, a sewing needle, a Bible with pages worn soft at Psalm 71, and a faded photograph of her parents creased in the middle where she'd folded it too many times to count. No shoes, just a scarf, a handful of coins, and a single hairbrush with broken teeth. She closed the box, tied it with twine, and crept down the stairs barefoot, careful not to let the wood groan beneath her. In the parlor, Lucille lay snoring. In her rocker, mouth slack, a whiskey glass at her feet. The Reverend wasn't home off on one of his council calls, though Marianne knew better. He often returned after midnight, smelling of pipe smoke and rose perfume, muttering scriptures. No one had requested. At the door, she paused. Then she bent, placed the box down carefully on the threshold, and tucked a folded note beneath the twine. Her handwriting was small and steady. "If anything happens to me, please give this to the man who noticed." She didn't sign it. Have to, and then she slipped out into the dark. Outside town, clouds rolled over the moon like secrets too heavy to hold. Caleb sat by his forge, sharpening the last of his blades. The sound of steel on stone was steady, one stroke after another. Not rushed, not idle. He wasn't a man who waited for signs. But something in him stirred like a mule sensing a storm. When he heard the knock, it wasn't loud, just a taps, hesitant. He opened the door and found her there. Marianne soaked from the mist, hair clinging to her face, dress wrinkled and torn at the hem. Her eyes weren't crying, but they held the look of someone who used to. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Caleb stepped aside without a word. Inside, he placed a blanket around her shoulders and poured warm water into a basin. She didn't resist when he took her hand and examined her wrists. Didn't flinch when he handed her a cup of broth. Didn't speak again that night. Not until the fire burned low, and the silence between them felt less like distance and more like shelter. "I left everything," she said. "Good," he replied. She looked at him. "That's all you'll say?" Caleb met her gaze. Sometimes leaving speaks louder than shouting. She smiled, but only a little. Then she leaned her head against the chair's armrest and closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to rest in a room where no one demanded anything of her. In the early light of the next morning, the Reverend stood at his doorstep in his long coat, staring at the box by the door. He saw the twine, the handwriting, the emptiness of the hallway behind him. Lucille stepped out behind him, hairpinned. Tight, she's gone. Coates didn't speak, just picked up the box and turned toward the road. "You think it was that blacksmith?" she asked. He paused. "I think it's time the town remembered who built this church." His tone was calm. Lucille narrowed her eyes. "You going to make a sermon of it?" He looked ahead, voice like stone. "No. I'm going to make an example. The road out of Bells." Hollow twisted between dry gullies and brittle cottonwoods, silent under the weight of things left unspoken. Marianne sat on the edge of Caleb's porch, wrapped in his old army coat, staring at the sky like it might provide answers. She hadn't asked for anything, not food, not protection, not sympathy, and Caleb hadn't offered words. He brought her coffee. That morning, strong and bitter, and nodded once when she thanked him. That was enough. Inside the cabin, the table was bare except for the small box Marianne had carried in her arms. The one she'd retrieved before dawn when she realized she couldn't leave it behind. Caleb hadn't asked what was in it. He never asked. Things that didn't matter. Around midday, the sound of hooves rose in the distance, slow, deliberate. Caleb stepped out to meet it. Marianne stayed seated, tense but still. The sheriff rode up with dust on his boots and suspicion in his eyes. "Morning," he said. "Heard you had company?" Caleb said nothing. The sheriff nodded toward the porch. "Word is, she walked out on the Reverend's house. You aware that girl's under church care? She's not property." "No," the sheriff agreed. "But in this town, reputation is currency. And Reverend Coates doesn't like folks stealing his. His arms, he isn't owed anything he didn't earn." The sheriff sighed. "Look, Caleb, just bring her back. Let this quiet down." Caleb didn't blink. "She stays." Marianne stood slowly, voice steady. "I'm not a fugitive." The sheriff looked at Horelli, looked tanned. Something shifted in his expression. Saw the faint swelling along her jaw, the thin scars along her wrists, signs he hadn't wanted to see before. He adjusted the reins. "Fine, but I'll tell you, both now Coates won't take this lying down." And with that, he rode off. That evening, as the sky dimmed to copper, Caleb hitched up his mule and cart. Marianne stood beside the barn, confused. "You're leaving?" He shook his head. "We are. I don't want to run. Not running. We're moving forward." She hesitated, then climbed onto the bench beside him. Didn't say another word for miles. As they passed the outer edge of town, Caleb reached into his coat pocket and handed her something smaller folded scrap of paper. She opened it. It was a map, hand-drawn and rough, marking a trail toward Dry Creek Ridge. "Safe house?" she asked. "No, just space. I got friends near the canyon old army folk. Nobody asked questions there." She folded the paper again and tucked it into her dress. Behind them, the town was growing darker, and inside the chapel, Reverend Coates lit a candle and spoke aloud to no one. "I warned her," he muttered, then louder to the shadows. "They think they're safe. But every soul in this town still answers to God." He placed Marianne's box on the altar and smiled. The sun had not yet touched the horizon when the church bell rang, not for prayer, but for judgment. Reverend Coates stood at the front steps of the chapel in full Sunday attire, though it was only Wednesday. His coat was pressed, his collar starched, his voice rehearsed. Townspeople began to gather, uncertain but obedient. The Reverend rarely summoned them without warning, and never on a workday. That alone made them nervous inside the chapel. Marianne's box sat atop the pulpit, like a relic waiting to be blessed or burned. Lucille stood at her husband's side, chin high, arms folded like a statue. She hadn't spoken a word to anyone since. Marianne disappeared, but now her presence was louder than any testimony. Coates raised his hand. The murmurs fell quiet. "My flock," he said, "we find ourselves in a moment of great trial." He gestured toward the box. "This girl, this lost, misguided soul was taken in by this church. We clothed her, we fed her, and in return she has turned her back on the word. She consorts now with a man who does not kneel in prayer, who does not pay tithe, who does not fear judgment." He let the words hang, then softer, "But the Lord sees, and the Lord delivers." Same morning, beyond the ridge, Caleb and Marianne reached an old homestead nestled between cottonwoods and sandstone. It wasn't much, just a frame house half rotted, a small spring, and a rickety barn. But it was far, and it was quiet. Caleb set down the supplies while Marianne explored the edge of the property. She moved slower now, but lighter, like the air. Itself weighed less here. "I could fix the shutters," she said. Caleb nodded. "We'll need them before the rains. Rains don't come until summer." He looked at her then, planning to stay that long. Marianne didn't answer, but her smile said enough. Back in Bell's Hollow, the sheriff paced the steps of his office, uneasy. The townspeople had left the chapel, murmuring about sin, reputation, and the blacksmith who corrupted the girl. There were doubts, no splinters of uncertainty in the eyes of the women. Especially Sheriff Hensley took one more look toward the church, then mounted his horse. He didn't ride toward the chapel. He rode toward Rodeg. The wind shifted. A hawk passed overhead. Caleb sensed the change before the hooves were audible. When the sheriff rode up, Marianne stood from the porch. She didn't run. Hensley dismounted slowly, hands raised. "Ain't here for trouble." Caleb stood behind her, silent. The sheriff looked at them both, then reached inside his coat. For a second, Caleb tensed, but what emerged wasn't a weapon. It was a letter folded once, stained at the corner. "Found this at the telegraph office," the sheriff said. "It's from a girl who used to work in Coates' house before Marianne sent from a sanatorium up in Abilene." He handed it to her. Marianne opened it with shaking fingers. "If someone still listens, I was not the first. Please believe her." She stared at the paper, then at Caleb, then back at the sheriff. "What do I do with this?" The sheriff cleared his throat. "You come back. You tell them." Marianne shook her head. "They won't believe me." The sheriff met her eyes. "Maybe not, but I will." By the time Marianne stepped back into Bell's Hollow, the streets had gone quiet in that tense, watchful way, like when animals sense a storm no one else sees coming. She walked beside the sheriff with her chin high, but her hands trembled slightly. Beneath the folded letter she clutched to her chest, Caleb didn't follow. He stayed behind at her request, knowing this part wasn't his to fight. She hadn't come to be defended. She had come to be heard. A few women paused at their porches as she passed. One of them, Sister Darlene, the first who'd ignored her words. Weeks ago, lowered her eyes at the chapel. Reverend Coates stood on the steps again, as if he hadn't moved since the last gathering. But his expression faltered when he saw the sheriff escorting Marianne directly toward him. "What is this?" he said, voice sharp. The sheriff ignored him and opened the chapel doors wide. "We're holding testimony right here, right now." People began to gather again. Word spread faster than fire and dry brush. By noon, the pews were filled, with familiar faces, some curious, some skeptical, some hollow with regret. Marianne stepped up to the pulpit, slowly. Her footsteps echoed louder than any sermon Coates had ever given. She didn't speak right away, just unfolded the letter and held it up for all to see. "This is from a girl who lived in the Reverend's house before me," she read aloud. The words shook the air like a church bell cracked in half. "He prayed with us at night, and then came into our rooms when his wife fell asleep. He told us it was the Lord's way of testing purity." Gasps broke out across the pews. Marianne lowered the paper and met the eyes of those who had seen her bruises and said nothing. "I said it hurt to sit, and you all looked away." There was no fire in her voice, only quiet truth that made it burn deeper. Coates stepped forward, face red. "This is blasphemy. I have served this town, this congregation." The sheriff blocked his path. "Sit down, Silas." Lucille Coates stood in the back, frozen. A single tear rolled down her cheek, not for her husband, but for herself. Marianne looked out over the congregation. "I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here to ask something harder. I'm asking you not to forget. Not again." She stepped down. The silence was deafening. Then, one by one, a few women stood. Sister Darlene, a young widow named Clara, even Lucille. None spoke, but they stood. Outside, Caleb waited beside his cart, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the chapel doors. Opened, and Marianne stepped out. She wasn't crying. She wasn't smiling either. She just walked straight to him. They stood. She said simply. He nodded. "Good." Behind her, the bell rang again, but this time, not by the Reverend's hand. It rang for truth. Spring crept into Bell's Hollow that year, like an apology. The chapel remained open, but the pews sat emptier than before. Reverend Coates had vanished by the end of the week. No service, no sermon, no goodbye. Just a note left on his desk, and a silence the congregation didn't dare question. Lucille closed the house and left town within days, her face hidden beneath a travel veil. In her place, Sister Darlene took up the altar work, sweeping the steps Marianne had once scrubbed on bleeding knees. No one said it out loud, but they all knew. Something old had been broken, and something new had started. Caleb had offered Marianne the cabin outright, even cleared out the loft where old army gear gathered dust, but she didn't accept. "I'm not ready to rest yet," she'd said. "I want to build something, not just hide in something made for someone else." So together, they rebuilt the homestead near Dry Creek Ridge. Caleb hammered the beams. Marianne laid the foundation stone. She planted herbs out back and patched her dresses with scraps of blue linen. On market days, she rode into town on her own horse. Not once did she look at the chapel. She didn't need to. A few months later, during the summer fair, townspeople gathered around the square, as was tradition. Children tugged at corn cakes. Fiddlers played old waltzes. Men traded tools and talk. And then they saw her Marianne, stepping from her wagon, dressed clean, face calm. She held a basket of hand-stitched goods and placed them at a stall beside the blacksmith's. No one dared ignore her now.